Point Blank is a crime fiction podcast. It may not be suitable for all listeners. We discuss violence in all its forms. The works we reference may include period slang, which some listeners may find offensive. The hosts also have a tendency to swear.
Episode 14, Part 2, The Girl with the Dragon Tattoo by Steve Larson. Hello, and welcome back to Point Blank. My name is Kurt, and joining me is Justin.
Hello, party people.
It is a party today, because we're going to be partying with Stieg Larsson and Elizabeth Salander and Michael Bloomquist.
Yes, in those real wild Scandinavian winter parties that have come to be known as classics in this genre we're going to discuss today, Nordic Noir.
That's right.
How are you doing?
I'm doing pretty good. I'm excited to talk about The Girl with the Dragon Tattoo. I'm getting out my Viking outfit to talk about Nordic Noir today, Justin.
And I'm wearing a parka and I have cross-country skis on.
Awesome. All we need to do is jump in the sauna.
And we need to, you know what I want to drink? I want to drink some of that aquavit or whatever it is. That Swedish, what is it, herbally liquor that has maybe an anise quality?
Yes.
I have not tried it, but this book actually made me want to pick up a bottle.
Aquavit is quite tasty. It does come in a wide variety of flavors, but you're right that anise is often in it, as is caraway.
Yum.
Some of the stuff is they put it in a barrel and they send it around the world in the belly of a ship before they bottle it and send it out.
So they do that because it actually imparts flavor or because it has a romantic quality then?
Well, I would assume more the second than the first, but probably it's a nice marketing gimmick. And then you can put that on the bottle.
We should record an episode of Point Blank on a sailboat.
One day we will, Justin. One day we will.
Good. We'll have to do some oceanic noir for that one.
Yes, but now we need to go back to the origins of the long ship. We need to go back to Scandinavia for The Girl with the Dragon Tattoo.
I'm ready. I'm looking forward to digging into this book. We've had a month and a half to wait, and let's do this.
Yes, so would you like to give us a little summary of the book, including spoilers of the ending?
Yeah, I do. I have a summary here. Some of it will be a little bit of repetition from the last episode, and some will be new information, and then I'll give a little bit of a spoiler. But you know what? It's funny. I didn't write too much of a spoiler for the summary. I didn't go way deep, but we will certainly get into it. The summary for this book this week, The Girl with the Dragon Tattoo. If you're following us from last time, you know that the author is Stieg Larsson, and this was the first book, the first noir book that he wrote. And it was the first in a trilogy called the Millennium Trilogy, which was released in 2005, turned into movies, become a huge national and international celebrated collection of novels, and it helped to put Nordic Noir on the map across the globe. And sadly, Stieg Larsson passed away before this book actually was published. He turned it in to his publisher, and then a few months later, he died of a heart attack. He never got to see his own fame. Anyway, the book is a psychological thriller set in Sweden. Stockholm and some smaller northern villages are most of the places where this book is set. The main character is, there are two main characters, you could say roughly. One of them is Michael Blomkvist. And at the beginning, he runs a magazine called Millennium. And if you listen to the last episode, you'll know that Millennium sort of serves as a stand-in for Stieg Larsson's own experience as a magazine publisher, because he had a magazine called Expo, which was more dealt with extremism and dealing with neo-Nazism in Sweden, being against it. And whereas Millennium is more a magazine that exposes corrupt financial practices in the fictional world where this book is set. In his duties as publisher, Blomkvist comes across some insider information, essentially, about a billionaire industrialist named Hans Erik Weinerstrom. And so he writes up this expose, and the expose turns out to be problematic because the info is not quite as accurate as he expected it to be. Maybe he got bad info or whatever, but he ends up getting sued for libel and loses the case, and he pretty much loses his empire, loses his magazine, and has to spend some time in jail. So the novel begins with our protagonist at the lowest point. And this, in part, is a novel about how he does work to restore his name. It's more than that, but that's part of it. Soon after the verdict, he receives a job offer, suddenly and surprisingly, really, by another wealthy industrialist who goes by the name of Henrik Vanger. And he's a retired CEO of the Vanger Corporation. So Blomkvist is hired to write Henrik's biography, but his real job, the one they're not talking about, is that he has to research a thing that happened in the past. Henrik's granddaughter Harriet went missing in 1966. And this happened on the Vanger's private island, because they're super rich. And they have their own island, essentially, where all the little houses, it's a little village, and pretty much everybody there is a Vanger or related to the family in some way. So Harriet goes missing on this island in 1966. Nobody was able to leave or exit the island because of a traffic accident on the road. So the question is, what happened to her? Because there's no body. They dredged the waters around the island, and they couldn't come up with her. And they interviewed everybody, and nobody knew where she went. So it's a cold case, essentially. And in a lot of ways, the beginning and the setup for this book is like a locked door mystery, like Agatha Christie would write. There are only a number of people that could possibly be the perpetrator, but we don't know who or how. Somebody's not telling the truth. So the way that Blomkvist gets involved in this case is that he accepts this offer with the good money, but not just for the money. He does it because Henrik promises to provide him dirt on Weinerstrom, and that's the guy who sued Blomkvist for libel. So we get to know a lot about Blomkvist as he moves up to this small island to investigate this cold case, essentially. We get to know a lot about Henrik and his grandson Martin and the rest of the Vanger family, because they're all interviewed. And this is a sort of a slow burn to start the story, because Blomkvist comes up there. He doesn't roll up his sleeves and start punching people like you would see in a Chandler story. He goes and digs up newspaper archives. He goes and investigates old pictures, and he interviews people and asks them questions about the past. So it's a slow burn. We sort of put the pieces together slowly but surely, like a very large jigsaw puzzle. And while the first 50 pages or so was fairly slow for me, it really started to heat up as he started to invest himself in the case. I started to feel invested as well. But he's not the only main character in the story. There is another. And that's odd for novels to have two very strong, relatively equal characters. I would give Blomkvist sort of the lead as the number one main, but the other one is Lisbeth Salander. In a separate but relatively equal plot thread, we meet her. She's a countercultural 20-something in the late 90s. She's an introvert with a dark past. And she was ruled early in her life as legally incompetent and is therefore still a ward of the state. They pretty much hold on to her money and to sort of decide her fate in a lot of ways. She's a punk rocker. She's tattooed, pierced, third-wave feminist, hacker. She serves as a nice foil for Blomkvist, because he's a middle-aged, sort of milquetoast guy. He's got some good qualities, but he's not what you'd call like a typical hero. He has a lot of foibles and a lot of complications, and he's not necessarily... And he just doesn't have those heroic qualities you'd expect from the genre. So we get to spend time in her world and learn about her struggles and a lot of the violence she has faced. And this book is about violence perpetrated by men against women. A lot of that comes through the perspective of the Salander character, who has experienced some very harrowing things in her life and during the course of this book as well. So, early on, Salander gets hired to do a background check on Blomkvist by Vanger. So that's the early part. But then later on, she comes back and joins Blomkvist's research team. He actually hires her because he knows what she's capable of doing, because he's seen the work that she did in her background check. So she comes into the fold, and that's when the story really starts to heat up, when these two sort of opposites, people from very different experiences, different generations, come together to combine to try to figure out what happened in this cold case with Harriet Vanger. So I really like their dynamic. No, let's not say I like it. I found it interesting. And I think that they're interesting characters to be put together. By together, I mean not just in terms of working together. They actually have an intimate relationship that's sort of casual, because Blomkvist has a relationship with a publisher over at the magazine as well. There's a little bit of polyamory going on in this story and like sort of sexual liberation, which was good. And it's a nice contrast to some of the predatory sexual stuff that happens in this book that is critiqued. So I would say that this book starts slow, ramps up, and then becomes really lightning fast toward the end. For 600 pages, this book, I flew through it. It goes from pretty calm and pretty even-handed to all of a sudden pretty violent. We get to hear and experience some of the terrifying things that Salander undergoes when she is essentially attacked, and both in the past and in the present by the men who are put in position to care for her or provide her what she needs from the state because of her position as a ward. These people abuse their privileges and abuse her and commit terrific sexual violence, and that's one of the major threads of this book, the themes. Another thing that was particularly wild is the plot twist toward the end as we work toward uncovering who committed the crime of Harriet Vonger. And, of course, one of the characters that we've spent a lot of time with in the story turns out to be the culprit. I don't know if I want to actually say his name right now, but we will soon. This book, in terms of writing, it's not a poetic book. I wouldn't call this literary fiction. It might be in part because of the translation. It did get written in Swedish and translated to English. So there might have been something lost there, and there's a terseness to it. But I think overall, my impression is that Larson isn't a particularly literary writer. He got his career in writing started in journalism, and this is really his first literary book, or at least his first experience writing fiction and having it published. So this book is all about plot. It's about plot and it's about theme. It's about the kind of world that we are experiencing in Sweden, the noirish qualities of the atmosphere, being dark, being winter, being sort of sparse, friendly people, but all this real dark undercurrent. And then on top of that, there's this issue of sort of critique of corporate structure, critique of finance, critique of people in high places, abusing systems, and how this sort of economic structural critique gets sort of mirrored in the critique of predation of men upon women and the way that power corrupts and power is used for bad, and how that gets exposed in this essentially David versus Goliath story. So as the case heats up, there's violence, there's sex, there's torture, there's a lot of surprises as we get to the end and find out who the bad guy is. And then from there, how Blomkvist sort of restores his name and gets the bad guy who burned him at the beginning of the book. I really enjoyed the mood of this book. I can't say if it exemplifies traditional Nordic noir or defies it. Kurt discussed Nordic noir in the previous part 1. But I'll say this, what starts as a locked door mystery widens to something greater. It's an indictment of capitalism, or at least corruption in high places, and an indictment of the violence men perpetrate against women. Larson was a socialist and a social activist, and some of that is clear in this work. Other Nordic noir writers in Sweden came from the left, but in particular, this book examines not so much working class crime or the ways that crime is discussed in American detective fiction, but exposes crime among the capital class and exposes the structural problems therein. So this is a mix of Agatha Christie, a mix of American detective fiction, and then all those thematics from Nordic noir that we learned about from Kurt in the previous episode, and we'll talk more about today. I like this book, and I call it a definite hit, especially for the content and what it does and what's new that it brings to me as a reader. But I would give it an even 4 stars because it doesn't have the bite, the sharpness, or the surprise that the best American detective fiction or any crime fiction writers have that take it to that next level. It's just not there. What do you think, Kurt? I think last time you called it a 3.5. Are you sticking with that rating or have you changed?
Well, I feel like I should describe it a little bit better. I personally, yes, it's a 3.5, but that said, if somebody asked me, well, give me 5 novels to introduce me to like modern crime fiction, this would be on that list of those 5 novels. Because I think it does a lot of things really well. It's, as you said, it engages you throughout the 600 pages. And frankly, Stieg Larsson makes what probably should be really boring narrative pretty interesting. Like most of this novel is investigating. It's going through files. Time is just, trickling by. Like a lot of stuff that should be boring is not. And he injects moments of real violent action just enough to like keep you going. And there's always it's building. It does a nice job of building. So you want to get to that next section, that next page, that next experience. So for those reasons, like it's high on my list of books to recommend to somebody to read. But as you said, it's not a literary novel. So for personally, it drops that rating down a little bit.
What you just said is that's the same. I was sort of shocked by this is like a paradox. Like, how can this book be so riveting and yet nothing really happens? Because for so long, like you said, he goes to people's houses, and like if we're reading Chandler, the Marlowe might go to an office and interview somebody and discover some drugs or discover some gangster activity. And in another place, there's a dead body. And in another place, somebody wants to beat him up. Like he encounters physical threat and he encounters verbal threat. In the case of this story, when the research is being done, it's like literally in a library, or he interviews an old lady. And you don't get any sense that there's a threat, but there's an ominousness to the whole thing.
Yes.
Which stirs you on another level. It's sort of the subconscious, and it affects you emotionally, but you don't have to actually fear. I never once, at least in the first 400 pages, feared for Blomkvist's life. That's not a thing. Maybe that's very American because we're notoriously violent. And in Sweden, the things are different.
My guess is that actually comes from Stieg Larsson's personal experience, because he spent so much of his life researching this extreme right-wing movement in Scandinavia, and he had these death threats against him, even though he never knew how serious they were. So he kind of lived this life of having this ominous cloud over him, where he had to protect his home address. He had to do these things, and really all he did, he wasn't like out, well, occasionally he was probably out in the streets doing various things, but most of what he did was just researching in the library or through their own publications and whatnot, putting the pieces together of who was connected to this extreme right-wing movement in Sweden. But he was constantly fearful of his life. And I think that maybe living like that translates into this novel and being able to keep a suspense where day to day nothing is really happening, but eventually that there's a threat there, and it's building.
That's interesting because in a sense that if that's accurate, then what we're getting here is a more realistic take on what detective work is like. Just like we've discussed in other stories, these private detectives, if you actually spent time with a real private detective, you'd be bored out of your mind because so much of it is quiet, just like a cop. They're not constantly engaged in like high level tense activity. A lot of it's downtime and a lot of head work. In this case, we're seeing that, but somehow Stieg Larsson made it riveting. If Chandler didn't have any experience as a private detective, and so we get Marlowe, who gets into crazy trouble all the time. With Dashiell Hammett, at least he had the experience of being out on the street doing the actual following. So there's some root to what Sam Spade actually does in that book and what the Continental Op does. But this is sort of a different take on detective work and how this is showing you the other side, the indoor stuff, the stuff where sometimes real work gets accomplished.
That's a theme of Nordic Noir, that you often see time passing. You often see the detective or the investigator, in our case, a journalist, go through periods where nothing happens or they just hit dead ends or whatever. That is something that the genre is sort of known for, is this more realistic depiction of what investigative work looks like.
Well, it worked here, and if that's the case, then I'm curious to read some other texts, because I do like the way that they can slow it down but still hold that slow burn tension for the reader. It makes for a good read, especially in the winter.
Yeah, for sure. In this book, we have actually a pretty wide variety compared to a lot of the books that we read, cast of characters. We have dozens of family members, we have community members, we have then the core group of characters. I mean, I think it would be hard to approach this novel and not be compelled by the character of Lisbeth Salander. But is there, how do you feel about her, or are there other characters that maybe secondary characters that stand out in this book?
I mean, those two, her and Michael, are the big ones, and we have Henrik, who plays a major role, and I did enjoy spending time with him. And Martin plays a major role, and I didn't know to what extent at first, but I felt like these were all just sort of placeholders for future plot development. To be honest, I'm not sure that there's a character, like I have the list here, and I'm like, I don't, some books just have a character, a minor character that really stand out. I don't have a strong one for this book. I feel like it's an ensemble cast. They all sort of play their part, but they're all sort of neutral to me, except maybe like the woman who ran the restaurant, who has some entanglements, sexual entanglements with Michael. Like all these little small scenes where things actually happen, I get drawn into, but they're usually momentary and then they're gone. So no, I don't really have a big one. What who do you have on your mind?
Well, I actually have a very similar take on it, because despite this wide cast of characters, you're right. They do feel like they're very much almost characters in a television show or something like that, where they're there to fill in the background. They're there to have a name, but they're not they're not super compelling by themselves. And I even, to some degree, I mean, I find Lisbeth Salander to be a pretty good character. And I don't know how much, I'd have to have a time machine or whatever to say how much of an influence her particular character has played on the genre or whatever. I just don't know off at the top of my head, to have this strong, younger female character, alternative lifestyle, whatever. I wonder how much of that is from the book, how much is that from the movie depiction. It's an odd character, and I'll come back to that in a little bit. But
Yeah.
going to Bloomquist is that once I knew more about Stieg Larsson's personal life, it's hard to not see him as this very Mary Sue character. It's hard to not see Bloomquist as a stand-in for Stieg Larsson. There's so many similarities.
Yeah.
And the way, and also because that he is the guy who, while he's not perfect, he still, he treats Lisbeth as a person, as he should. And that's kind of how Stieg Larsson sees himself. The relationship that that Stieg had with Ava is not exactly similar, but sort of similar to the relationship that Bloomquist has with his publisher. There's just a lot of the fact that he's a researcher, and, I don't know. It's hard to not see him as that stand-in. And once you see him as the stand-in, it makes, for me, his relationship with Lisbeth to be, I don't want to say troubling, but a little weirder.
Yeah. I got that. I as much as I tried to go into this, I didn't know anything about these characters. I had not read any reviews. I did not see any of the films. So I just knew that there was a young woman in this movie, and that there was some talk about, I just heard rumors about some of the aspects of the film. I wanted to like Lisbeth Salander more than I ended up liking her, and I think the reason I struggled to like her as fully as I wanted is in part because of this thing you talk about, the author surrogacy and Stieg Larsson and the way that he presented her. Most of my comments about characters in the story are about her, because Michael Blomkvist is so easy. He's just like this milquetoast, middle-aged, fighting the good fight, but he's not exactly exciting or dramatic or heroic, or like in the way that makes a character stand out. And he's not necessarily like deeply thought-provoking or intelligent. He's just like a guy doing a job, sort of like the private detective in Patricia Highsmith's Strangers on the Train, who just Gerard, who goes around like doing detective work. He's just working. And he has some relationships, and he eats some food, and he drinks some coffee. I do like what he does, and I like the story of the unheralded activist, which that sort of ties into your author surrogacy, Mary Sue stuff. He fights a good fight. He gets down in the dumps, and his name gets tarnished and then he fights and wins at the end. That's a little bit of fantasy, I think, in Stieg Larsson. Perhaps he can't be interviewed because he died right away, so we don't get to really get an insider take. But with Elizabeth Salander, like, why did he write this character the way he did? I feel like as much as I appreciate having a strong woman protagonist, she's a little bit of the misunderstood teen freak trope, that the black sheep that's like, oh, so black sheep, like it's so obvious that she's different from everybody else to the point where it's like a little cliche. And so I just feel like I think he handled her clumsily.
Yes, I would agree with that. And you're right. It feels like somebody writing out of his knowledge base and out of his, like apparently he had like a niece or something who sort of fit roughly this character, and he like asked her a bunch of questions about how she'd react to something like, that had happened. But I really don't like this idea that, his idea of the strong woman is also the woman who was abused, and then has like almost this idea that the whole reason that she is in a counterculture is because she's been a victim of abuse, and that like that explains her antisocial general nature. And I don't know, there's just something problematic about combining all of those elements to me that after reading the book as opposed to seeing the movie really kind of stood out for me. And I'm not saying that it's bad. I'm just saying, and there's also there's almost 15 years from when this was originally written to differentiate the time frame. So, I do have a little bit of a problem with that.
Again, we can't get a new take on it or get his perspective, but what we can take from this is that it was written in the late 90s to 2000s, because he took time writing it. This was the first book of 3 that he submitted in 2005, so he must have been working on it for a while. This does capture sort of 90s gothy counterculture, a different, an era that we grew up in as young people, but it sort of captures that in a way that feels a little cliche, especially now, though, because it's been done and done and done. And was she the trope, or was she a trope then just got magnified and sort of blew it out beyond the stage it was at when this book came out? But yeah, I think it's a weak point of the book, and it does, I think, compromise the book the way that if I were an editor, I would have said, if I didn't just want to pocket a whole bunch of money, I would have said, take this back and develop this character more complexly. She sounds like just a cardboard cutout of every 90s goth girl sort of fused together with like dramatic like generation issues, and that's the stand-in for like the predatory thing and the abuse. I feel I have sympathy for her though as a character. Obviously she endures terrible things, but this was a concoction made by an author, and that clash of the real extremes and her real extreme alienation, it just little shades of gray would have been nice to help soften the obviousness of her black sheepness.
Yeah, and this is not something that that has not gone unnoticed within, the criticism of these books. But, and I haven't read the second and third book that was written by Larsson. There is a progression within these characters, and I don't know, that may very well change in book 2 and 3. We may see, I do know that we get more information on Elizabeth's background, so maybe some of that context would put this in a different light. We just don't know that at this time.
Sure. Yeah, and that's fair. We got to comment only on what we know from now and leave the rest up to future reading. What about the Vengers? We meet like 5,000 members of the Wenger family. Any of them, move you?
No, not really. One thing we do know that Stieg Larsson is doing in this book is he's very conscious of the fact, and so is actually our character, makes a comment on it in here, that this is a play on the locked room mystery. And so we know that not only is our author conscious of the genre, but so are in a way, so are some of our characters acting within the narrative. But this Wenger family just really, I don't know, they really play just a bit part for the most for me. You have lots of stories where you have the large family, you've got one that's kind of approachable, you've got another creep who doesn't talk, it seems very, there's nothing necessarily new here. But I think Larsson does an okay job with it. I think the twist at the end is decent. I think, and I won't give that exactly away, I feel like, but the family member where there's a twist at the end, like that's interesting.
Yeah. Yeah, we can say it's a family member, right?
Yeah.
That's pretty much, we know it's a Vanger. We meet all the Vangers. There's the old grumpy Nazi asshole brother of Henrik. There's Henrik, who's like the friendly old grandpa type that's likable and invites us in a little bit. There's Martin, who's flamboyant and running the CEO now. He's like the CEO of the company. There's Harriet, who's missing. There's a few others, cousins and wives and guys out there. Just, they're all sort of eccentric in their own way, and they stand out enough from the other, but none of them are particularly memorable in the way that you'd expect from a more three-dimensional character. They're all serving a purpose.
So like you said earlier, like this book is really driven by plot.
Yeah.
Maybe we should talk a little bit about that plot.
It's propulsive. This is a narrative that's driven by what's happening next. And you don't know. You know where you want to get, but you don't know how you're going to get there. And I think so much of what makes this work is that we are spending so much time with Michael Blomkvist trying to solve this case in real time, in essence, with him from one person to the next. And it's fun because it's almost like we're sitting on his shoulder, visiting this village for the first time. This is unfamiliar territory for him. So he's taking us into this world and leading us from one clue to the next and letting us examine it with him. And I think maybe if you have a mystery mind or a mathematical mind, you're trying to put the pieces together, that's what is happening here. It's essentially you are putting the puzzle together with him as the story goes. And because the chapters are written in, briefly, with brevity and with clarity, there's not a bunch of discursive or background information or tangents. This is just like clean-cut writing, tell you what's happening, not a bunch of metaphors drawing from the Viking lore and various other mythologies. It's just focused on what's happening now, and that keeps the reader in the moment. And I think if we weren't in the moment at all times, this book would fail because it's too fucking long, and there's too much quietness for us not to be actively pursuing the answers. I think that's really it. It's a pretty simple recipe. But did you notice anything in particular in terms of the plot or the style that stood out to you or surprised you?
The whole book doesn't necessarily surprise me, but what I think Larson did very well is that we just talked about characters being sort of essentially typecast, but even this plotting, it's not an elaborate, well, I guess it's kind of elaborate, but it's not a surprising plot necessarily. But he does such a masterful job of utilizing relatively common elements and putting them right in the right places and keeping that plot moving. And I think when the investigation starts to get stagnant, he throws in a little bit of relationship drama. When the relationship drama folds out, he throws in a little of the Wagner family drama, and then we've learned a little bit more about the investigation. So it has a nice rise and fall of each different element that's leading us to the final conclusion. And he does also a nice job of just raising that tempo and that volume throughout the book to get to the climax.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's it. It's pretty basic stuff. He doesn't do anything I've never seen before, but somehow he managed to do everything right, in the right way, with the right pacing, and this book came out at the right time. Like, sometimes it's not always the writing, it's what you bring to it, it's the timing. I mean, how did this book explode? How did this book become one of the biggest books of the past 30 years? I don't understand how that happened, and I haven't read much about that phenomenon and if people have explored the cultural zeitgeist of the time and what influenced that. But have you read anything that sort of pointed to reasons why this in particular blew up the way it did?
No, I really haven't. I mean, I'm just running through my head. It does sort of correspond to a little bit of a rise of anti-corporate critique. There's that element. I think you're right.
Yeah.
I think you're right about the Lisbeth Salander character in that her type of character was just becoming more culturally appropriate to have in mass media.
Yeah.
I think that's a big thing. We're hitting that cusp of where some of these Originally, like you said, the original title of this book is Men Who Hate Women. But
Yeah.
that discussion was becoming a little bit more prevalent in society around the same time as well, about these
Yeah.
issues.
So it might have just been right time, right place with the corporate globalization
Yeah.
movements and rising feminism, and a lot of like sort of lefty progressive issues were gaining a lot of momentum, and maybe that inertia fed into the success of the book.
Yeah, and I do think that the movie stuff, which came so quickly with the publication of the book, was a big deal as well, because let's face it, in the movie versions, especially Elizabeth Salander is highly sexualized, and
Sure.
a title like The Girl with the Dragon Tattoo versus Men Who Hate Women is a hell of a lot more marketable.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
I think those elements help.
I have a question for you. You saw both films, the Swedish and the American take on it.
Yes.
Which, if gun to your head, which one did you feel was a better take?
I think the Swedish one, but it could be skewed because I saw that first.
Sure.
I think they're both, as I recall, it's been quite a few years, but I feel like both of them are fairly accurate to the book. I mean, they do make some minor changes as you need to. In my recollection, they seem fairly faithful to what we found in the book.
Interesting. Well, I don't feel like I'm propelled to go check them out. I don't feel the need. But if I were to take one, I'd probably go with the Swedish because it was the first one and it's closer to home. But what about, we've talked about historical context, especially in terms of Stieg himself. He was this guy with a long history of social activism. He was really deep in that activism, not just a dilettante. And this book is sort of a way that he can capture some of that dedication and turn it into a book that speaks to these issues of justice to a wider and a different kind of audience. And I wonder to what extent this book affected people in terms of thinking about issues of justice and crime and power and stuff like that, and how many people who read it just liked it because it was a good yarn. Did he actually influence people in the way that he would have probably laid in bed thinking about it, going like, oh man, if people read this book, maybe we can have a social revolution and women will be liberated. Like, that stuff obviously doesn't happen, but I wonder to what extent his message translated into anything at all. I don't know. It's that kind of stuff is hard to measure.
Yes, it is. I do know, for example, that writers of crime fiction within Scandinavia have become a little bit more common as actual, like, going on the news to be presenters or experts about the crime and politics that are currently going on in Scandinavia. I know, for example, an author that we didn't talk about, but is Joe Nesbo, who writes the sort of unfortunately named in English Harry Hole series, which is supposed to be like Harry Holly or something like that. But anyway, he's
Sure.
he's a little bit more in the hard-boiled. He gets his influences more from American hard-boiled fiction. But he's been on the news many times talking about crime and corruption within Scandinavia, and is considered an expert in that field. So on the one hand, I think we can certainly say that because of books like Stieg Larsson, there are crime authors within Scandinavia who are looked at as being experts, not only in the fiction that they write, but being social commentators as well. And that they are seeing things within the political structure, within the social structure of those countries that, maybe other people aren't seeing or aren't articulating as well.
Well, that's interesting. That alone, that shows something. There's been a shift in Swedish culture. So, and if there was going to be a shift, I would expect it to come out of Sweden and not so much out of the United States or Japan or something, who see that this is more of an import for them and less central to their identity.
Yeah, and I would say that from what I know, maybe this is a resurgence of having social commentary within crime fiction, and I don't necessarily know that we can say that 100% globally. But I think we've seen a lot of that critique from the books we've looked at in back in the 20s, 30s, and the 60s, 70s, whatever. But maybe that toned down during the 80s or the 90s. And maybe, because of success like this, we're seeing a little bit more of it now. Again, hard to say.
Sure. And I remember coming across that article maybe last year that I'm not sure if we talked about it in an episode, but one where crime fiction tends to be more left wing and classic thrillers tend to be more right wing. And there was somebody making that contention in a newspaper like The Guardian or something. This clearly, while it doesn't confirm anything, it points to political agendas being firmly a part of or an aspect of the genre, at least in some circles. So it's out there, and politics does play into this stuff all the way going back to Hammett, especially leftist politics in some of this crime fiction, because it's about haves and have-nots. Whenever there's disparity, you either talk about it or you ignore it. And if you talk about it, you're going to face the fact that some have more and some have less, and there are crimes and there are power imbalances that help feed into these sort of cycles that occur. And he captured that well, and I think the book is regarded for a reason. But I'm curious to know if the other two hold up. And then we never talked about somehow. Now there's a couple things here. He wrote the 3 books, submitted them to the publisher. He died. Then there was the big blow up between his partner Ava and his dad and brother, who all of a sudden stepped into the picture and said, "Hey, by the way, there's no will, so we're going to take control here." And that hasn't been resolved. She has part of book 4 in a computer. But now, since then, the publisher has given permission to somebody to write a sequel, book 4 and book 5, from a different author with no notes. None of this is related in any way to anything that Stieg Larsson has condoned or approved, or his ghost. And so those books have come out. I've heard nothing about those books, and I don't want to. I feel like that's sort of sacrilege. But I've heard a little bit about 2 and 3, good and bad. But I'm wondering if this was the kind of magic that can last, or if he just hit it once. I'm afraid to read these books and find out these characters lose their connective tissue or the magic something that makes them work in the way they did in this one as new characters to us.
Yeah.
But I guess we'd have to read the other books in order to find out.
Yeah, but I think the real gift that Stieg Larsson gave us here is he gave us certainly one book that raises a lot of good issues. And not only that, because of the success of this book, we're getting so many Scandinavian Nordic Noir books translated that otherwise would have never been translated.
That is true. That's great.
He is certainly not the only one to have good things to say within the Nordic Noir genre. So, that's the real legacy. It opened up this whole genre for English readers, and it brings up the conversation here. I think this is a book that's still worth talking about. We're still talking about it. People are still picking it up and reading it, and and hopefully they'll pick up something else, because authors like Henning Mankell, Joe Nesbo, they have something to say too, and so do a whole laundry list of authors that I can't name at the moment, but they have good things to say, because political commentary is part of the Nordic Noir tradition.
Yeah. And so that's why we can't talk about this book without talking about the politics. But you made a great point. And in some ways, that's a good way to end. It's not precisely what he did in his fiction, in his literary creation, that put him on the map for us. Sure, we got the book, we read it. It's a good book. It's not the kind of book that I would say belongs up with the classics of the best of the best. But to open up that door and to turn Nordic Noir into an institution, but not in a way not in a capitalist sense where it becomes this powerhouse that just puts out a bunch of crap, but it exposes all these writers that I would have heard of, that you would never have heard of, and gives them a chance. And it's almost like his parting gift was, hey, y'all, come step up to the plate and sell some books and expose your ideas to the world. And these are good ideas to hear in this time and place when people are starting to turn toward anti-democracy tendencies. It's nice to see people with a fresh take on crime and dealing with issues that have meaning to real people and that affect everybody, and in a way that is not only powerful and personal and political, but also entertaining and provocative. So that's probably the greatest gift he could give on his way out. Time for Real Stupid Mysteries.
Really Stupid Mysteries. Justin, this time I have a really stupid mystery series for you, and it is it is thematic with our show. This is the Eric Blood Axe Mysteries. We follow real life 10th century Viking King Eric Haraldsson, aka Eric Bloodaxe or Eric the Bloody Axe, as he travels the North Sea, solving and committing murder after murder. He's
an anti-hero.
Well, it's a double-sided axe, so it goes both ways.
Sure.
First in the series, we have Blood Eagle Justice, followed by the Abbey Abduction. And then the third book in the series is This Axe Tastes Like Blood. One of the more critically acclaimed books is Natural Bjorn Killers.
Oh.
Yeah.
Clever.
Yep. Followed by Berserker Knights. And this is a complete series. The last book in the series is Blood Axe's Last Stand.
Aw, that's nice. So you have a whole arc for him. You know where he comes from and where he goes. Okay.
Yep.
I like the one about tasting the blood on the axe, because who's doing the tasting?
Well, that's one of his specialties, is that he can he tastes the blood, and that helps him solve the crime.
Oh, so he's a little bit of a bloodhound.
Yes. Well, it's easy to solve the murder when you were the one who chopped off the head, and then I did that.
So these mysteries aren't really for complex minds, because at the end it's always him who did it.
Well, no, not always. I mean, he does solve some crimes, but it's justice and the judicial system was a little different back then.
I see.
Did you know it was considered legal this might be wrong, but I've heard this in Viking times, where if you committed a murder, you should be okay as long as when you went down the road, you turned yourself in at the next house down the road.
Interesting.
Yes. If you tried to escape, then you would get in trouble.
Okay. Well, if those laws were still in place, this would be a wild country.
It would indeed.
Oh my Lord, we have 5-round burst. We're going to cue some music, and then we're going to pop in 5-round burst. 5-round burst. The first book I read for this episode is Rhode Island Red by Charlotte Carter. This is the first of the Nanette Hayes mysteries, and it was put out by Warner Books in 1997. I found out about Charlotte Carter from The Blacklist, which is a book column written by Michael A. Gonzalez that examines out-of-print books written by mostly African-American authors. Now, the book is set in New York and features protagonist Nanette Hayes. She is sort of like a down-on-her-luck prodigy, a hip African-American woman with a master's in French, getting by in the 1990s New York, playing saxophone on the streets for change. There's a little bit of a Mary Sue quality going on here, but I forgive it generally because I enjoy the plotting and the general feel of the book. In the case of the plot, things get complicated when she helps out a musician named Sig. She invites him to crash at her place one night, and the next morning she wakes up, comes out to the living room, and finds his dead body in the living room. And in his saxophone, she finds $60,000 stuffed into it. So, what does she do with this? She goes around and asks him questions and does a little bit of investigative work. Turns out he was an undercover cop. And now, why was he in her house? Why did he befriend her? And why was he pretending to be a homeless sax player? These are the questions that we seek to answer. In addition to the primary one, what is the Rhode Island Red that everybody's after? So, we have an amateur sleuth. We follow her through the steamy streets of New York as she seeks to solve these mysteries. We meet cops, hoodlums, mafiosos, and her ex-boyfriend Walter, who keeps trying to like bring her back into his life. I call this a fast-paced, action-packed book, but also there's a lot of humor and a lot of cultural references to France and sort of living in this sort of jazzy, Frenchy, high society, or at least bohemian-esque society. This is sort of like Chester Himes with the Diggable Planet soundtrack. Now, I said that she's a bit of a Mary Sue, but I like the story and plan to read the second one, Kokova, which might, I hope, be set in France. It's not a deadly blow to the head, but it's a solid hit with a gold saxophone. I would check it out.
Up next, I have Noir by Christopher Moore. This came out in 2018. It's published by William Morrow. And if you know of Christopher Moore's work, you'll know that he's one of those authors that's hard to put into a genre. It's loosely comedy, often with science fiction or fantasy elements, and this one is no different. It very loosely incorporates noir genre elements. It takes place in post-World War II San Francisco with a band of somewhat stereotypical noir characters as they are pulled into a government conspiracy. And yes, there are aliens. I will keep this short as I think it fails as a true homage to the noir genre. So don't let the title fool you or the cover fool you. It's not really for fans of the noir genre. This is for fans of Christopher Moore's other work. It's really a book of his style more than anything else. And, you know, he has some very notable books such as Lamb, Fool, or Bite Me, and I found those all very enjoyable. And I did enjoy this, but as a noir crime fiction book, it's lost in the San Francisco fog, and this shot is well off the mark from that perspective. Instead, it finds its mark really within that zany Moore camp, and if you're familiar with his work, then I would recommend this. Otherwise, it's a pass.
All right, so my second book is Miami Purity, which was written by Vicki Hendricks and published in 1995. Hendricks got her MFA from Florida International University in 1992. This is a taut neo-noir, loosely modeled on James M. Cain's The Postman Always Rings Twice. And in a lot of ways, it's pretty clear that is the case. The main character is Sherry. She's a down-on-her-luck working-class gal who makes poor decisions and finds herself in trouble on a regular basis. She has worked the strip clubs and bars of South Florida, scraping together a living, and she recently got off for the death of her former husband. The story starts with her scoring a job at a dry cleaning establishment called Miami Purity. The place is run by Brenda and her son Payne, Payne. Centered around Sherry's affair with Payne, the story blends hard-boiled noir with hyper-eroticism. There is sex, violence, incest, manipulation, sex, betrayal, and sex. There's a whole lot of sex in this book. The cool thing is that the sex is from the perspective of Sherry and mostly woman positive, but this is a gritty book about lowlifes making terrible decisions. I liked it. It inspired Megan Abbott and helped usher in a wave of great women noir writers at the turn of the century. Let's call it a near-fatal conk on the head followed by a tumble in a large hot dryer.
That sounds pretty interesting. I might have to check that one out.
Not exactly my cup of tea, but I think it set the stage for some pretty cool stuff.
Well, I'm going to close out our 5-round burst today by doing 2 Nordic Noir tales. First up, we have Jar City by Arnaldur Let me just try that again. Arnaldur Indridason. It came out in 2004 and it's published in English from Picador Press. This is the first Inspector Arnaldur novel. And for some reason, this one's been getting a lot more buzz recently. I don't know if there's another one coming out or whatever, but it's been getting some more publicity. And this comes from the cold island of Iceland, where we get a checklist of Nordic Noir elements. There's a family mystery, check. There's a cold case, check. Cultural tension, check. Corporate involvement, check. And brooding and windswept locations, check.
Perfect.
Yes, it's all Nordic all the time. Inspector Arnaldur must wade through decades-old clues when an old man is murdered and the murderer leaves behind very cryptic clues. The murderer of the murderer leaves behind very cryptic clues. Old secrets are revealed, and the forensic evidence is a strange trail which leads Arnaldur into the quote-unquote Jar City, which I'll let you discover that for yourself, what that is. Overall, I would call this one a hit for me. It is a little slow in places, but much like an Icelandic winter, you'll have to deal with some frost to enjoy the sun. And finally, awesome. I am going to review sort of the book, at least in my interpretation, started the Nordic Noir genre. This is Roseanna, a Martin Beck police mystery. This is the first book by Maj Sjowall and Pierre Wahloo. It was originally published in 1967. I read the Black Lizard edition, which is the most recent publication. Roseanna is not only the start of the acclaimed 10-book Martin Beck series, but also, for many fans, it is the first book. And actually, it's a book that holds well to the time. In this first book, Beck must find the murderer of a young woman who is pulled from a beautiful Swedish lake. And like we see sort of in Girl with the Dragon Tattoo, time is an important element because it doesn't all happen within a couple of days or a couple of hours. This is a case that takes time to solve. In that way, it establishes a realism of actual investigation in the way that a murder might actually be solved. And this was something of a revelation in this crime fiction for 1967. And as I said, for an older book, I think this one stands up pretty well. There are a little bits of it that are dated, but overall, the plot, the narrative, it holds true. It still feels like something that could be more or less modern. So like a Swedish fish to the face, this one is a hit. I will be looking forward to continuing this series. I know this series has a lot of strong social commentary and really key elements of the Nordic Noir tradition, so it's one that I really want to spend some time with. And for those reasons, I would recommend Roseanna.
Cool. That's exciting. That book's on my shelf. I thought at one point we were thinking as a way to debut the Nordic Noir genre to do that book instead of Stieg Larsson, but I think Stieg Larsson is a good entryway, and I'm glad we did that. But still, I would want to read that book too and see how it compares, given that it is the number one.
Yeah, I would recommend it. I thought it was good. And there's a boat involved, so I like it.
Hey, can't argue with boats.
That's right. Well, thank you.
Because they don't talk back.
Well, thank you once again for joining us for Point Blank. We really appreciate you listening. And what are we going to read next, Justin?
All right, so future episodes. Episode 15 will be John D. MacDonald, good old Florida Noir. We're going to be doing A Flash of Green. Following that, episode 16, we're going to visit another new author to us in this series, Walter Mosley's Devil in a Blue Dress. That's the first of his books, at least in the crime fiction sense. And episode 17, we have Dorothy Hughes's In a Lonely Place. I've been itching to do this one for a while. I've heard very good things about it. Shout out to David Gonzalez. And then episode 18, Horace McCoy, They Shoot Horses, Don't They? This is a weird little book written in the 1930s that is unlike anything we've talked about yet. But I read it a while back, and it's just fucking weird and great, and I can't wait to talk about it.
Well, that sounds like a pretty good lineup, and I'm excited to read some Florida Noir on here. There better be alligators.
Yes, they better be alligators. That would be something, wouldn't it?
They shoot alligators, don't they?
Last I heard, they shoot everything, so especially here.
Yes, Florida man shoots gator.
Yes.
Well, thanks, folks, for joining us. If you want to get in touch with the show, you can check us out on Facebook at Point Blank, Hard-Boiled Noir and Detective Fiction. So you can send us an email at pointblankpodcast@gmail.com or send us a tweet at pointblanknoir.
We also have a Facebook group that's connected to our site. So if you join our site, you can also ask to join our Facebook group, and sometimes there's some more discussion rolling in there if that's your thing. So also, we'd like you to spread the word. We're still looking to increase our fan base and get rich off of this. Just kidding about that last part. If you like the show, give us a rating on iTunes. Also tell your friends who are readers or who like watching crime fiction on television. We'd love to expose them to our insights or whatever it is that we do here.
So thanks for listening, and until next time, I don't know, watch out for alligators shooting you or something.
Stay out of blizzards.
Yeah, watch out for that Viking behind you.
Ah! Bye.
Bye-bye.
Point Blank is under a Creative Commons license. Music is by Justin. Copywritten works are property of their respective holders.